welcome Jeffrey Purtee. Podcasting is an on-demand digital audio and sometimes video medium that allows you to choose when you want to listen, or in some cases watch, a specific show. It is episodic in nature. Generally, there are no one-off podcasts. Think of it as a radio show, but a radio show that you can listen to when you want to. The fundamental difference between podcasts and some other streaming mediums is the way podcasts are designed is when you access it, it goes right to your device. It's not always a phone, but it downloads directly so that you can listen to it offline. Now, with modern podcast systems, this happens automatically. It's actually playing and downloading at the same time, so you don't quite realize. But when you look down sometimes and you're no longer getting a cell signal, and yet the podcast is playing just fine, this happens to me all the time when I listen to podcasts in the car. That's why. It's because the medium is being downloaded as you go ahead and listen to it. And the variety of podcasts is nothing sort of extraordinary. For some reason, it never really took off into 2010s. Up to 2010, there still wasn't much mind share for podcasting. It was there, it was part of iTunes, it was part of the iPhone structure from 2005 on, but it really didn't explode until about 2010, 2011. And since then, my gosh, the subject of podcasts is amazing. We're going to touch on some of those today. Now, one of the fascinating things about podcasting is some people associate it with Apple. Apple did not come up with the term podcast. And in fact, when the phrase began to gain traction, Apple started suing everybody that used the word pod until they realized that they're getting all this free publicity from people using it, and they finally backed off. It was one of the interesting things I learned in the research, that Apple was not really in favor of this at the beginning until they realized what incredible free publicity they're getting. Now, this is an iPhone. Do we have any iPhone users here? iPhone users? Okay. I see two hands were not raised. And just a quick tip, this is the 21st century. Feel free to join the rest of us. Just a note. Now, you do have smartphones, right? Of some kind? Okay.
It's just slow.
You know, we have a club member, I'm not going to name names, but her initials are Rachel Ringenbach, who once gave a speech about the joy of the dumb phone. Even Rachel, you notice, now has an iPhone and loves it, right?
I do.
It has changed your life, hasn't it?
It has.
Before you got the iPhone, you didn't have a boyfriend, did you? You got the iPhone, you have a boyfriend, right?
No, actually I had a boyfriend before the phone.
Oh, okay. Well, okay.
It was a close time.
Thanks for ruining my story. Just feel free to, you could have just agreed, but no, that's okay. I have a variety of podcasts here that I regularly listen to. Now when I send out the video of this particular speech, I want to alert you that I'll send links to this one, so you don't need to take notes if you don't want to. One of my favorite is This Is Your Life by Michael Hyatt. Michael Hyatt is a legend in the blogging and podcasting industry. He calls himself the virtual mentor. It's basically life lessons from Michael Hyatt. He broadcasts once a week. Wonderful. Have you ever read the book, The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss? It was on the New York Times bestseller list for about 5 years. Fascinating book. And Tim Ferriss has one of the most interesting podcasts I'll ever listen to. He calls it life hacking. But the Tim Ferriss podcast touches almost any topic in life, what he calls it lifestyle design, that you can possibly imagine. That's one of my favorites. One of the big ones is actually an NPR radio show called This American Life. It's regularly on your NPR station, but they also do it in a podcast format. Now, have you listened to This American Life at all? It really can be funny and humorous. They have stories from around the country and the various subcultures. And then finally, I have on this one 3 what I call learning podcasts. They're not really so much for entertainment. For example, there is a course on putting on your own podcast that I listen to by John Lee Dumas, putting on your own webinar, and finally, There's a whole podcast devoting to self-publishing your book, the Self-Publishing Podcast. It is a delightful learning resource that, I admit, you don't actually have to have an iPhone to listen to, but it does make you a much happier person if you do have an iPhone. So with that, I want to just say, podcasting has exploded. It is so prevalent that starting in 2016, most new vehicles will allow you to access podcasts live right over the satellite web with just a small subscription fee, just as if you had an iPhone right in your car. So if you're not already listening to podcasts, I encourage you to go out on your phone, on the web, just do a search for podcast, and you will be astonished at the wealth of resources